Imagine a city that once had 1 million people living in it and now has just 360,000. Where a steel plant that once forged beams for New York skyscrapers has been swallowed by weeds. Where entire blocks stand empty and houses sell for $1. This isn't a post-apocalyptic movie. These are real American cities: Detroit, Cleveland, Youngstown, Pittsburgh. Half a century ago, they were the heart of the richest economy on Earth. Today, they're known as the Rust Belt. What happened to the region that built America? Where did millions of jobs disappear to? And is it possible to bring life back to places that seemed frozen in time forever? Let's dig in to understand the fall. You first have to understand the rise. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the region around the Great Lakes, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, parts of Illinois and New York, became the industrial heart of the planet. It had the perfect combination: coal and iron ore deposits, shipping routes across the Great Lakes for cheap raw material transport, and millions of workers, both local and European immigrants. Pittsburgh became the steel capital. Companies like U.S. Steel and Bethlehem Steel turned the city into the world's largest steel producer. Detroit became the automobile capital. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler built their empires there. Cleveland, Youngstown, Gary, Toledo, Buffalo. Dozens of cities sprang up around the factories like mushrooms after rain. World War II only fueled this boom further. The region became the arsenal of democracy, producing tanks, planes, and ships for the Allies. Factories ran 3 shifts a day, with no days off. There weren't enough workers to go around, and wages kept climbing. A factory job back then wasn't just a paycheck. It was a ticket into the middle class without a college degree. Labor unions, especially after the reforms of the 1930s, won workers fair wages, health coverage, and pensions. A steelworker could afford a house, a car, and send his kids to college, all on a single income. Cities flourished. In 1950, Cleveland was America's 5th largest city, with nearly 915,000 people. Detroit was 4th, with almost 2 million. Theaters, museums, universities, and grand mansions rose across the region. It supplied the entire country with steel, automobiles, rubber tires, appliances, glass, practically everything. It seemed like it would last forever. But the very foundation of that success already contained the seeds of future disaster. The first problem started long before anyone ever uttered the phrase Rust Belt. Reason 1: no real competition. After World War II, European and Japanese industry lay in ruins. American steel and auto companies were left with almost no serious competitors on the world market. A handful of giants, U.S. Steel, GM, Ford, Chrysler, effectively split the market among themselves. That might sound like an advantage, but it turned into a trap. When a company dominates a market without real competition, it has little incentive to invest in new equipment, boost efficiency, or innovate. Why modernize a plant when profits are already guaranteed? Researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis would later show that by 1980, the market share held by American steel, auto, and rubber producers reached as high as 90%. Prices stayed artificially high, and productivity barely grew for decades. Reason 2: a rebuilt Europe and Japan. By the 1960s and 70s, Germany and Japan had rebuilt their industries from the ground up with the newest technology available. Japanese steel mills were built with the most modern equipment of the era. American plants, by contrast, were often running machinery that was 30 to 40 years old. Japanese steel turned out to be cheaper and often better. Japanese cars were smaller, more fuel-efficient, more reliable. When the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 sent gas prices soaring, Americans switched en masse to fuel-efficient Japanese compacts instead of the gas-guzzling giants coming out of Detroit's Big Three. Reason 3. Unions and wages. This is a sensitive subject, and it's worth being precise here. Labor unions won fair conditions for workers, and that was the right thing to do. But as foreign competition intensified, high labor costs, wages, pensions, healthcare made American products more expensive than imports. Companies found themselves trapped. Cutting costs meant clashing with powerful unions, but not cutting costs meant losing market share. Reason 4. Automation. Even when factories did modernize, it often meant fewer jobs, not more. A single worker with new equipment could now do the work that used to take 5 people. Reason 5. Outsourcing. Starting in the 1970s, companies began shifting production to places with cheaper labor, first to southern U.S. states with weaker union protections, and later to Mexico and Asia. The numbers are staggering. Between 1970 and 1990, the U.S. share of the global steel market fell from 20% to 12%. Steel industry employment dropped from 400,000 to 140,000 workers in just 2 decades. In 1984, Democratic presidential candidate Walter Mondale, criticizing Reagan's trade policy, said it was turning the industrial Midwest into a rust bowl. Journalists picked up the idea and started using the term Rust Belt. The name stuck instantly because it perfectly captured what was already happening. The factories were rusting, and with them, the hopes of entire generations. Statistics are an abstraction. To grasp the scale of the tragedy, you need to look at specific cities. Youngstown, Ohio, Black Monday. September 19, 1977 went down in the city's history as Black Monday. Youngstown Sheet and Tube announced it was shutting down its plant and laying off 5,000 workers all at once. That was just the beginning. Over the next few years, the city lost roughly 40,000 steel industry jobs. Interestingly, residents didn't give up without a fight. Workers, together with religious leaders, tried to buy out the mill and reopen it as a community-owned enterprise, a unique effort for its time. The attempt failed due to lack of funding, but it shows just how desperately people fought for their city. Today, Youngstown's population is less than a third of its peak. Entire residential blocks have been demolished, and the city has officially adopted a strategy of smart decline, deliberately shrinking its urban infrastructure to match a smaller population rather than trying to rebuild to its former scale. Cleveland, from Millionaire's Row to emptiness. In 1950, Cleveland had over 914,000 residents. By 2022, that number had fallen to roughly 360,000, a loss of more than 60% of its population. The legendary Millionaire's Row in the suburb of East Cleveland, home to 40,000 wealthy residents in the 1950s, emptied out. Today, fewer than 14,000 people live there. In 1969, the Cuyahoga River, which runs through Cleveland, literally caught fire due to the level of industrial pollution, a symbol of the price the city paid for its industrial might. Detroit, the symbol and the deepest fall. No city is more associated with Rust Belt decline than Detroit. The capital of the auto industry, the birthplace of the modern assembly line, officially declared bankruptcy in 2013, the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. Detroit's population fell from nearly 2 million at its peak to less than 640,000 today. Entire neighborhoods turned into wastelands, abandoned homes, overgrown lots where dense city blocks once stood. Photos of the abandoned Michigan Central Station and the derelict Packard plant became visual symbols of deindustrialization itself, appearing in hundreds of documentaries and photo essays. Gary, Indiana, a city built to order for a single factory. If you're looking for the most extreme example of a city's dependence on a single industry, it's Gary. The city was founded in 1906 not as an ordinary town, but literally as a company town for U.S. Steel. The corporation itself picked the site on the shore of Lake Michigan, laid out the streets, and built the Gary Works plant, which would go on to become the largest integrated steel mill complex in North America. At its peak in the 1950s, Gary had a population of nearly 180,000, with over 30,000 people working at the mill. The city also held special significance for Black America. It drew large numbers of Black families migrating from the South during the Great Migration, and in 1967 Gary elected Richard Hatcher, one of the first Black mayors of a major American city. But dependence on a single industry proved fatal. When demand for steel began to fall, the city had nothing to fall back on. There was no other significant industry to speak of. The number of steel workers in Gary dropped from 30,000 in 1970 to just 6,000 to 7,000 by the mid-2000s. Meanwhile, the population shrank from a peak of nearly 180,000 to less than 70,000 today, a decline of more than 60%. The consequences were among the harshest of any city in the region. By the early 2010s, the city had more than 6,500 abandoned buildings, and roughly 1 in 4 parcels of land sat vacant. The poverty rate hit nearly 40%. Time magazine wrote as far back as 1972 that the city resembled an ash heap on the edge of town. And over the years, that description only became more accurate. Gary consistently ranked among the most dangerous and most distressed cities in the United States. Still, recent years have shown signs of a turnaround. City authorities, working with federal partners, have significantly reduced violent crime. Homicides fell by a third in just the past year compared to a recent peak. And most notably, Nippon Steel, the Japanese corporation that recently acquired U.S. Steel, announced a multi-billion-dollar investment specifically in Gary Works, the largest investment in the city's history. That doesn't mean instant revival, but for the first time in decades, the city has a real economic tailwind from outside. Gary's story may be the purest example of just how dangerous it is when an entire city's fate is tied to a single industry and a single company. When that industry collapses, the city has nothing left to stand on. Pittsburgh, a different path. But not every city followed the same road to ruin. And it's worth saying that now, because it matters for understanding what comes next. Economic collapse always has a second, quieter face: migration. As factories closed, people moved to wherever the jobs were, mostly south and west, to the Sun Belt states of Texas, Florida, Arizona, California. This phenomenon became known as the Second Great Migration, and it fundamentally reshaped the country's demographic map. But not everyone left in equal measure. It was mostly the young, educated, and ambitious who left, those with the resources and means to start over somewhere new. Those who stayed were largely older residents and low-income families, people who simply couldn't afford to move, physically or financially. This created a vicious cycle. The fewer active working-age people remained, the harder it became to attract new investment, and the more young people left. The social consequences were severe. Crime rose. Infrastructure crumbled. Schools, hospitals, and public transit shut down as the tax base that funded them kept shrinking. But the darkest side of this process became what's now known as an epidemic of despair. The opioid crisis, when the pain of losing work becomes physical pain. In the mid-2010s, Princeton economists and Case and Angus Deaton coined the term deaths of despair. It refers to deaths from drug overdoses, alcohol-related liver disease, and suicide, which rose sharply among working-age people without a college degree, precisely the group that had made up the backbone of the Rust Belt's working class for decades. The mechanism here is twofold. On one hand, it's literally physical. Years of hard manual labor in factories and mines left workers with chronic pain in their backs, joints, and hands. When pharmaceutical companies began aggressively marketing prescription opioid painkillers like OxyContin in the 1990s and 2000s, doctors in post-industrial regions prescribed them by the millions. In some counties, the number of prescriptions actually exceeded the adult population. On the other hand, it's psychological. The loss of work, status, and purpose, and the collapse of communities that had once revolved around the factory and the union, created ideal conditions for addiction. When regulations on prescription opioids tightened in the mid-2010s, people struggling with addiction shifted en masse to illegal alternatives, first heroin, and from 2013 onward, the far more dangerous fentanyl. That turned the crisis into an outright catastrophe, claiming tens of thousands of lives across the U.S. every year. The geography of this tragedy maps almost perfectly onto the Rust Belt and neighboring Appalachia. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and West Virginia have topped the national overdose death statistics for years running. Among the metro areas with the highest opioid death rates are Cleveland, Detroit, and Indianapolis. In West Virginia, the poorest state in the former industrial belt, the opioid death rate is among the highest in the entire country. Researchers emphasize that the crisis didn't simply strike poor areas. It struck regions where, until recently, stable, well-paying jobs had existed for people without a college education, and then that work vanished almost overnight. In other words, this isn't just about poverty itself, but about the loss of meaning and structure that stable employment once provided. In response, a genuine grassroots resistance movement took shape locally. Judges, social workers, firefighters, paramedics, and volunteers in communities like Newark, Ohio fight for every life, every single day, with naloxone, a medication that reverses opioid overdoses, always at the ready. It's an exhausting, often invisible battle that has been going on in the region for well over a decade. Researchers with Rust Belt studies point to an important nuance. Efforts to revive old industrial cities haven't always benefited every resident equally. Gentrification, turning rundown neighborhoods into fashionable, expensive ones, has displaced the poorest residents who had lived there for decades. Cleveland's revitalization, for instance, has been criticized because the mass demolition of blighted homes often hit communities that simply lack the resources to renovate them. And here the story takes an unexpected turn. Because some Rust Belt cities didn't just survive, they found a new way forward. Pittsburgh, the leading example of transformation. A city associated with steel for a century made a bet on a completely different economy: education, healthcare, and technology. Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh became magnets for talent and research, especially in robotics and artificial intelligence. Over the decade from 2008 to 2018, Pittsburgh's unemployment rate fell by 21%, while average incomes rose by 25%. Google and Uber moved in. Uber even tested self-driving cars on the city's streets. The former site of the Eliza Furnaces steel mill was transformed into Mill 19, a modern technology complex that still preserves parts of the original steel mill structure as a nod to the past. That doesn't mean Pittsburgh got its former population or industrial might back. It didn't. But the city found a new identity instead of trying to resurrect the old one. Detroit, from combustion engines to electric vehicles and art. After its bankruptcy, Detroit also began a slow recovery. A city that once built gasoline engines is now trying to become a hub for electric vehicle manufacturing. Abandoned factory spaces are being converted into art studios, lofts, and co-working spaces. A distinct aesthetic has even emerged, Rust Belt Chic, a romanticizing of industrial heritage as part of the region's cultural identity. But it's worth being honest. Despite all the revitalization efforts, historic preservation, green infrastructure, casino tourism, Detroit in the public imagination is still primarily associated with decline, ruin, and loss. One study of visual content about the city found that images of destruction and decay still dominate how Detroit is perceived from the outside, even today. Smaller cities are trying to find themselves too. Even Youngstown, one of the hardest hit cities in the region, has recently started attracting venture capital and entrepreneurs drawn by cheap real estate and a skilled workforce left over from the industrial era. But there's a flip side to this tech-driven revival. An interesting and troubling wrinkle of the present moment. Tech giants are now building massive AI data centers across the former Rust Belt, taking advantage of cheap land and leftover industrial-era energy infrastructure. But this is creating new tension. The enormous power consumption of these data centers is driving up electricity bills for ordinary factories and residents in a region that's already stretched thin. The Rust Belt story isn't just a tale of the past. It's a story that still directly shapes American politics, literally, not just figuratively. Why a handful of industrial states decide the fate of the whole country. In the U.S. presidential election system, people don't vote directly for president. States cast votes through the Electoral College. Because of this, a handful of so-called swing states, states where the outcome is unpredictable and could go either way, effectively decide the outcome of the entire election, even if the rest of the country votes fairly predictably. 3 states from the former industrial belt, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, became just such a gateway to the White House. For decades, they were referred to as part of the Blue Wall because they reliably voted for the Democratic candidate. 2016, an unexpected breakthrough. In the 2016 election, Donald Trump built much of his campaign around appealing directly to workers in post-industrial regions, promising to bring back steel and auto manufacturing, renegotiate trade deals, and stop factories from moving overseas. That message resonated. Trump unexpectedly won Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, states that had voted for Barack Obama twice in a row, and that one secured him the White House. A symbolic example, Stark County, Ohio, home to the Timken Steel Company for decades, had voted Democratic in 3 consecutive presidential elections before flipping to Trump in 2016. Later cycles, swinging back and forth. But holding on to that support proved difficult. In the years that followed, manufacturing in these states kept shrinking. Trade wars and tariffs hit steel suppliers, farmers, and small businesses across the region. In 2020, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin swung back to Democratic candidate Joe Biden. Then in 2024, all 3 states voted for Trump again, returning him to the White House. This back and forth isn't random. It reflects just how unstable and sensitive to economic promises the former industrial belt's electorate remains. People here don't vote for a party out of habit. They vote for whoever they believe can restore the sense of economic stability the region lost back in the 1970s and 80s. The same promises, regardless of party. It's worth noting, promises to bring back the factories and revive manufacturing have been made by politicians from both major parties for decades, not just by one candidate or one ideology. It's a recurring thread running through American politics, from Walter Mondale in 1984, who effectively gave the world the term Rust Belt, to today's debates over tariffs, manufacturer subsidies, and bringing factories back home, so-called reshoring. But researchers who study the region agree on one thing. You literally cannot bring that era back. The world has changed. Automation, global competition, and new technology aren't going anywhere. The question isn't how to restore the past, but how cities find new meaning once the old economic model has run its course. Some cities, like Pittsburgh, found a new path through education and technology. Others, like Detroit, are still caught between an image of decline and real attempts at revival. Still others, like Youngstown and Cleveland, have deliberately chosen a strategy of smart decline, not trying to win back millions of former residents, but learning to live and grow with the population that remains. This is a story about what happens when an entire model of civilization, the industrial economy of the 20th century, comes to an end, and about just how painful, uneven, and unfinished the search for what comes next can be. The Rust Belt isn't just a region on a map of the United States. It's both a warning and an example of resilience. A warning about how quickly seemingly unshakable economic power can crumble, and proof that even after the deepest fall, there are still people in these cities willing to search for new life among the ruins of the old. If you're interested in stories about places that were once the center of the world and ended up forgotten, hit like and subscribe. I've got plenty more stories like this one. And in the comments, let me know, does your country have its own Rust Belt city, an industrial giant that once thrived and is now fighting to survive? I'd love to read your stories.